In giving expression to this moment of its self-conscious downfall as the result of its experience, it reveals itself to be this inner perversion of itself, to be a deranged consciousness which finds that its essential being is immediately non-essential, its reality immediately an unreality. The derangement cannot be taken to mean that in general something devoid of essence is regarded as essential, something unreal is real, so that what for one person is essential or real would not be so for another, and that the consciousness of reality and unreality, or of essentiality and unessentiality, would thus fall apart. If something is in fact real and essential for consciousness in general, but is not so for me, then in the consciousness of its nothingness I have at the same time, since I am consciousness in general, the consciousness of its reality. And since they are both fixed in my consciousness, this is a unity which is madness in general. But in this state only an object is deranged for consciousness, not consciousness as such within and for itself. But in the outcome of experience which here has come to view, consciousness in its law is aware of being itself this reality, and at the same time, since this very same essentiality, the same reality, is alienated from it, it is, qua self-consciousness, qua absolute reality, aware of its own unreality. In other words, it holds the two sides in their contradiction to be immediately its essential being, which is thus in its own most being distraught. In paragraph 376, we finally come to the second part of the title of this section, the Frenzy of Self-Conceit. And what Hegel's going to talk about here ultimately is going to be madness in general, Wahnsinn im Allgemeinen. There's a little bit of a play on words there, because it's the Allgemeine, the universal, that we've been worried about and trying to realize and then losing ourselves in and all of that. So, and we saw that in the last paragraph we had a sort of conflict between two universals as well. And it was a conflict that could not be reconciled, overcome, avoided. Instead, what happens is self-consciousness is overcome. So in its experience, its Erfahrung, this is a great play on words too, in a certain respect too. I mean, experience, so Erfahrung, right? Fahren is this word that's used for traveling to a certain extent. I mean, there's other words as well, but there's this notion that we talk about the path of experience, and that's what has been happening with the law of the heart. You don't know where it's going to go until you actually step out and start going somewhere, start acting. What this led to is a self-conscious downfall, a bewusster Untergang in the German. And so how does this actually take place? So we have self-consciousness, which is a shape, a Gestalt, right? The shape that is that of the law of the heart. And what Hegel says is, in giving expression to this moment of its self-conscious downfall as the result of its experience, it reveals itself to be this inner perversion of itself, Verkehrung. Don't think perversion in a sexual sense. Just think in terms of being twisted up. I mean, that's the original sense that we get perversion from, pervertere, sort of twisted aside, bound up on itself. And Verkehrung has that original sense as well. So think of a consciousness that can't go straight, can't go where it wants to go. And then we have derangement that he's going to talk about, Verrücktheit. This harkens back to the Zerrücktheit, Zerrückt of the, being distraught of the last paragraph, when consciousness uncovered this contradiction and realized that it couldn't get past this contradiction. Now we have an intensification of that, a derangement. And this is what's going to lead to the frenzy of self-conceit. So he says, to be a deranged consciousness. How is it deranged? Now here is where Hegel gives us a depiction of what it is to be deranged, what it is to be affected in this way that really gets to the heart of something. And he's going to say, look, this isn't every case of being mistaken or even being insane. This is the cases where there's like a tragic conflict going on and you couldn't help but go crazy as a result of it. So what is this like? You notice that on this side we have the self-consciousness, the law of the heart, right? And then on this side we have the universal, the order, whatever it is that we're talking about. And self-consciousness encompasses both of them. What self-consciousness took to be essential, the law of the heart, its own being for itself, its own pleasure, turns out to be non-essential. What it took to be reality, it finds to be unreality. So he says, it finds its essential being is immediately non-essential, its reality immediately an unreality. Now here's where Hegel clarifies something for us that shows us that this is not just somebody like going off the rails and having a momentary lapse. He says, this derangement cannot be taken to mean that in general something devoid of essence is regarded as essential, something unreal is real, so that for one person, what is for one person is essential or real would not be so for another, and that the consciousness of reality and unreality, of essentiality and unessentiality, would thus fall apart. This is why there's a derangement taking place here. The person who is deranged is able to realize, as a matter of fact, I wouldn't even say is able to realize, is unable not to realize that they are deranged. The person who's totally crazy, who's seeing butterflies everywhere that are talking to him and telling him to drink bleach or something like that, reality, it's not even really in the picture. I mean, we might quibble here. I know people are going to want to bring up Lacan and psychosis, but just forget about that for the moment, right? We want to focus on this instead. This is a person who is conscious that there is a reality that ought to be what they are aligned with and realizing, and finds instead that they're not. This is a person for whom the conflict goes all the way down, and they're painfully aware of it, at least for a little while. The next paragraph, we're going to see something a bit different. So he says, if something is in fact real and essential for consciousness in general, but is not so for me, now I've got a problem. He says, then in the consciousness of its nothingness, I have, at the same time. Why? Because I am the consciousness in general. He says, I have the consciousness of its reality. So if I realize that I am out of touch with what is genuinely real, and yet I can't bring myself in touch with it, I can't make myself conform to it, that's much more torturous than just being out of whack with reality, isn't it? Where there's nothing like that. An example of this would be the affective experience that some people have in realizing that senility is starting to take hold of them. And they have enough of an understanding to realize that they're slipping, but not enough to change that somehow. And they think, well, it would be better in certain respects if I wasn't even aware of this, but until I'm not aware of this, at least I am aware of this. We can say similar things about people's morbid fears of death. We can go on and on about these sorts of things. What drives the person crazy is that they can't go completely crazy. What makes it so deranging is the fact that there is essentiality out there and they can't find a way back into it. And they had it at one point. So, he goes on and he says, since these are both fixed in my consciousness, this is a unity which is madness in general. Madness in the universal. Right? So he goes on and he says, this state is only an object. In this state, only an object is deranged for consciousness. So it sounds like it's getting a little bit better. Not consciousness as such within and for itself. But the outcome of experience which has come to view, consciousness in its law, he says, is aware of being itself this reality. Before it had that experience, before it tried out the law of the heart, tried applying it, it could have thought to itself, yeah, the world is screwed up and it's a mess and I'm not crazy, everybody else is crazy. Or it could have thought, well, maybe I'm, the romantic and I'm so different than the rest of the world. I'm what Hegel will call later on the beautiful soul, and that, world out there is rational and I'm just not rational in that way. No, it's now consciousness has realized I'm all of this stuff, and yet I can't bring it together successfully. So he goes on and he says, at the same time, since the very same essentiality, the same reality is alienated from it, it is, qua self-consciousness, qua absolute reality, aware of its own unreality. By being aware of its own reality, of being these things, of there being a conflict between it, it doesn't thereby escape. There's nothing soporific or tranquilizing in realizing, oh, there's a conflict there. I'll just take note of that. It goes all the way down to the very depths of its being. So he says, in other words, it holds the two sides in their contradiction to be immediately its essential being, which is thus in its own most being distraught, right? So it takes both of the sides of the contradiction in the contradiction to be immediately its essential being, which means that in its very essence, there is a contradiction, a Widerspruch, saying something against itself, not being able to be on the same page of itself, a non-coincidence occurring within the consciousness itself. And this is a very uncomfortable place to be. The heartthrob for the welfare of humanity therefore passes into the ravings of an insane self-conceit, into the fury of consciousness to preserve itself from destruction, and it does this by expelling from itself the perversion which it is itself, and by striving to look on it and express it as something else. It therefore speaks of the universal order as a perversion of the law of the heart and of its happiness, a perversion invented by fanatical priests, gluttonous despots, and their minions who compensate themselves for their own degradation by degrading and oppressing others, a perversion which has led to the nameless misery of deluded humanity. In this its derangement, consciousness declares individuality to be the source of this derangement and perversion, but one that is alien and accidental. It is the heart, however, or the individuality of consciousness that would be immediately universal. That is itself the source of this derangement and perversion, and the outcome of its action is merely that its consciousness becomes aware of this contradiction. For the true is for it the law of the heart, something merely intended, which, unlike the established order, has not stood the test of time, but rather, when thus tested, is overthrown. This its law ought to have reality. The law then is for it qua reality, qua valid ordinance, its own aim and essential nature. But reality, that very law, qua valid ordinance, is, on the contrary, immediately for it something which is not valid. Similarly, its own reality, the heart itself as a particular individual consciousness, is for it its essence, but its purpose is to establish that particular individuality as an objective being. Thus it is rather itself as not a particular individual that is immediately for it its essence or its purpose that has the form of a law, hence the form of a universality which is for it its own consciousness. This its notion becomes by its own action its object. Thus the heart learns rather that itself is not real and that its reality is an unreality. It is therefore not an accidental and alien individuality, but just this particular heart, which in all its aspects is in its own self perverted and perverting. In this long paragraph, number 377, we're going to see a very important juncture point where self-consciousness can get stuck and remain stuck quite easily in a figure of projection, essentially. Projection of evil, of perversion, as Hegel's going to call it, Verkehrung, onto the other, onto the world, in a way to try to avoid it for the self. This is something that a person can get stuck in, or they can continue to progress, which is what happens in the rest of the paragraph, and leads us to the end of this section and into the next dialectic. So Hegel talks about the heartthrob for the welfare of humanity, very romantic language, right? The person who's motivated by sentimentality and empathy and all this great stuff, right? The heartthrob for the welfare of humanity therefore passes into the ravings of an insane self-conceit, into the fury of consciousness to preserve itself from what? From destruction, a kind of fear. Why is this? Well, because we saw there's this fundamental contradiction underlying the relation between the law of the heart in the individual and the rest of the world, the order that the world is in. So he says it does this. How does it preserve itself from destruction? It does this by expelling from itself and projecting onto somebody or something or somebodies else the perversion, the Verkehrung, this twistedness, this being unstraight, right? And so he says it expels from itself the perversion which it is itself. It still remains perversion. And that's where this is going to end in this paragraph. But it can tell itself, no, it's not me, it's them. And now Hegel depicts for us a world that should be very familiar if you've done much reading of Enlightenment thought or of, romantic thought that is closely connected with the Enlightenment. Why are things so messed up? Well, it's because of those selfish, self-centered, into domination, into gluttony bastards at the top who are screwing everybody over, including me, the do-gooder, who's going to set everything right. They're standing in my way, and they're screwing everybody else over too, through their universal order. How does this work out? So Hegel talks about it like this. The person expels from themselves the perversion which is in themselves, striving to look on it and express it as something else. It therefore speaks of the universal order, which is required for any society or culture or community to work and to find meaning in it, right? It speaks of the universal order as a perversion of the law of the heart and of its happiness. So we're kind of back where we began, right? The world is unfair. The law of the heart is going to set things straight because I know, I'm the one who's actually, motivated properly to save humanity from whatever it needs to be saved from. And the universal order is doing the opposite. The universal order is itself a perversion of the law of the heart and of its happiness. Now, where did this come from? A perversion invented by fanatical priests, people who want to have other people see things their way. They can't accept any sort of opposition. Fanatical, right? Maybe it doesn't have to be priests necessarily. It could be commissars. It could be the boss who needs everyone to see things their way. It could be people on the left. It could be people on the right. It could whatever you want it to be, right? And gluttonous despots, he says. People who are... this is the way Plato depicts the despot, in his dialogues. The despot is enthralled to their own appetites. They just want more and more and more. Sort of like the corrupt Roman emperors or these corrupt princes and kings. Or revolutionaries sometimes turn into this as well. So he says... fanatical priests, gluttonous despots, and their minions. This is sort of like straight out of Rousseau. They're minions who compensate themselves for their own degradation by degrading and oppressing others. Rousseau says, to answer the question, well, why would anybody be, in a position where they're dominated by somebody else if they don't have to be so? Well, it's compensated by the fact that they get to dominate somebody lower on the proverbial pecking order, right? So, it's okay to be somebody's valet provided you can go kick somebody else beneath you. And on and on and on. And Rousseau is probably right about this, at least with some people. There are some people who are willing to put up with all sorts of indignities so long as they get to impose equal or at least compensatory indignities upon somebody else. So this is what Rousseau said was going on. This is what Hegel says the person motivated by the law of the heart is seeing. What happens is there's a perversion which leads to the, as he calls it, the nameless misery of deluded humanity. So this is pretty bad, right? We've got the people on top and their henchmen or henchwomen imposing a order, which is really an unjust order because it's not really universal. It just reflects the individuality of these other people, not anything that's for the universal. And it lands squarely on the backs of the rest of humanity who are treated terribly and have no say in it whatsoever. And now, who gets to be the white knight riding in to fix things? The person of the law of the heart. So he goes on and he says, in this its derangement, consciousness declares individuality to be the source of this derangement and perversion. Whose individuality, though? These guys, these bad guys. They're the ones responsible. So it's not just individuality per se. It's not my individuality that's at fault, because I have the beacon of the law of the heart within me to shine and light my way. These guys have anti-beacons, darkness. They just corrupt everything, make it worse. So the law of the heart now has a kind of equivocal status, doesn't it? So he goes on and he says, in this derangement, consciousness declares individuality to be the source of this derangement and perversion, one that is accidental and alien. It is the heart, however, or the individuality of consciousness that would be immediately universal, that would come in and fix things. Whose heart? My heart, right? And he says, here we go. That is itself the source of this derangement and perversion. The outcome of this action is merely that its consciousness becomes aware of this contradiction. So here's where the person could realize, oh, wait a second. How do I know I'm not one of those people? The mere fact that I don't have power doesn't mean that I've actually managed to be completely right, be completely straight, not be perverse at all, turned in, turned away. So he goes on and he says, the true is for it the law of the heart, which is something merely intended. Unlike the established order, has not stood the test of time. The established order, you can at least say, and this is what defenders of order always do, look, this has been working for us. Don't screw it up by trying to fix it. We don't know whether the person motivated by the law of the heart is really going to make things better, or they might make things worse. Think about somebody like Robespierre. You could say that he was motivated by something like the law of the heart. He wanted to improve humanity. He saw that, getting rid of the despots, getting rid of the priests was a very important way to do that. And he unleashes a terror which consumes the French nation and ultimately leads to his own demise as he finds people yet more radical than himself. So this is a big problem. We can find other things along these lines as well. The true for it is the law of the heart, something merely intended. When it is tested, it's overthrown. He says, this its law ought to have reality. The law of the heart ought to have reality. But that means the law is for it reality, qua valid ordinance, its own aim and essential nature. But reality, that very law, qua valid ordinance, is on the contrary immediately for it something which is not valid. So you got your choice. Law of the heart, not realized, ideal, good. Law over here, which actually has stood the test of time, bad, evil, unfair, but real. Which are you going to pick? So he goes on and he says, similarly, its own reality, the heart itself as a particular individual consciousness, is for it its essence. But its purpose is to establish that particular individuality as an objective being, out there in the world, replacing that old order, upturning it, liberating humanity, getting rid of the tyrants, all those sorts of actions. So he says, thus it is rather itself as not a particular individual that is immediately for it its essence, or its purpose as the form of a law, hence the form of a universality, which is for it its own consciousness. We've seen this already in the previous paragraphs. Insofar as my action, not the action of projection, but the action that's going to fix things, is a universal producing action, it is, in a certain respect, no longer just my action, and eventually no longer expresses the law of my heart, but law in general. It attains this status of universal ordering. So he goes on and he says, its notion becomes by its own action its object. So what does the heart learn? The heart learns rather that itself, the law of the heart, in its very fabric, is not real. And its reality is an unreality. So what do we have here? It's therefore not an accidental and alien individuality, but just this particular heart, which in all its aspects is in its own self. What do we see here? The attempt to displace perversion does not work. Comes right back. Hegel says, the law of the individual heart now realizes itself in all of its aspects, perverted and perverting. So what do we have going on here? How did it get perverted? Maybe by this world order. Maybe it's not quite so pure. Maybe it's not so untainted. Maybe it itself is something like the tyrant or the fanatical priest, engaging in oppression of others, creating nameless misery for deluded humanity. That's a problem. And that's where we reach. So we have two options. We can come to that point and we still have not gotten through the dialectic altogether, or we can just continue projecting onto others and stay stuck at that point in the dialectic forever.